The glitter of the shop windows and the shimmer of the chandeliers reflected in the perfectly polished marble floors filled the shopping center with a sense of exclusivity. People, absorbed in their purchases, leisurely moved from boutique to boutique. Everything seemed familiar and calm, until a sharp, indignant voice was heard. "You see this? It's simply unthinkable," exclaimed Lucy Randolph, a middle-aged white woman, known for her exactingness and her penchant for order. Her face was flushed with indignation, and her eyes sparkled like someone who was sure she was right. She pointed at a black man in a wheelchair, who was slowly moving around the mall. He was accompanied by assistants loaded with dozens of branded bags. "It's just a provocation," Lucy continued, drawing more and more attention to herself. "How can a person like him afford such purchases?" The crowd began to stop, to gather around. People looked at Lucy, then at the man, who seemed completely indifferent to what was happening. He confidently continued to move, looking into the windows and discussing something with the store personnel. Lucy turned to the manager of one of the boutiques she was standing next to. "Why did you let him buy half of your goods? Did you check where he got the money from?" The manager, confused and clearly not prepared for such pressure, tried to answer. "Madam, he paid for all his purchases honestly. We had no reason." "Honestly," she interrupted, her voice growing even louder. "It's impossible. It's clearly a scam or a fraud. People like him can afford such things. It undermines the entire reputation of our center." "Madam," the manager began cautiously, "we cannot judge people only by their appearance." "Then I'll do it," Lucy snapped. She took out her phone and dialed a number. The crowd around her held their breath, watching as she began to speak into the phone. "Hello, police. I'd like to report suspicious activity at the mall. There's a man here who's clearly buying expensive items through dishonest means. His behavior is highly suspicious. Yes, she paused, lowering her voice. "He's black." Her words echoed through the room like thunder. Whispers spread through the crowd. People looked at each other. Some openly expressed their indignation at her actions, but others preferred to remain silent. Meanwhile, the man in the wheelchair stopped at another boutique, turning his head in the direction of what was happening. His calm face did not express a drop of irritation, but his eyes showed a tired determination. He seemed to have expected this development. "Let's see how long he can keep this up," Lucy said, putting the phone away. Her lips curled into a smug smile. People like him should know their place, but she didn't know that this day would be the beginning of the end of her impunity. The crowd around her was beginning to thicken. People, attracted by Lucy's loud voice, frowned in anticipation of what would happen next. The black man in the wheelchair slowly turned in her direction. His gaze was calm but firm. He looked at Lucy with such confidence that her complacency began to tremble slightly. "Excuse me, madam, but did you say something about me?" His voice was soft, but there was a sharp edge to it, as if he already knew what was coming next. Lucy, not expecting him to address her directly, frowned for a moment, but her face immediately assumed an expression of superiority. "Yes, I said it, and I'll say it again, if you so desire. How can you, a man of your position, afford such purchases? It raises many questions." The man sighed, his gaze hardening. "And what is it about my situation that worries you so much?" "Oh, don't pretend," Lucy chuckled. "Everyone here knows what's going on. You don't belong here. This mall is for people who've worked hard to deserve to be here. And you're just putting yourself out there." The man didn't look away. "Excuse me, but isn't that what shopping is all about? Choosing what you like and paying for it?" Lucy snorted. "Don't pretend. We all know that real money isn't that easy to earn honestly. But people like you always find ways to bend the rules." "Like me?" he asked. His voice grew a little louder. "You judge me only by how I look." At that moment, the boutique manager approached Lucy. He tried to remain neutral, but there was hesitation in his eyes. "Madam, perhaps we could try to settle this peacefully." Lucy turned sharply to him. "Calm down. Do you see what he's doing? He's buying up everything, as if he wants to show that he can do this just to prove something to us." The manager visibly tensed up, but decided to try to please. "Madam, perhaps you should cool down a bit. Our client is not breaking any rules." "Rules?" Her voice grew louder. "What about the rules of decency? Or are you saying that we should now tolerate people like him ruining the atmosphere of this place?" The man in the wheelchair intervened, his voice firm. "Excuse me, But it seems that Madame does not understand the difference between rules and prejudices. Prejudice, Lucy cried, her face flushed with anger. I'm just telling the truth that everyone is afraid to say. You don't belong here. Who decides where my place is? You. He looked her straight in the eyes. At that moment, the first cries were heard from the crowd. Leave him alone. He didn't do anything. What is this? Some kind of show? But Lucy seemed to have stopped listening. She felt that she would be supported, and her voice rang out like a whip. Listen, I've been here since the first day this center opened. I know who comes here, who spends money to maintain its status. And you are not one of those people. The man looked at her again, his voice even. Are you saying that you have to be a certain skin color or physical condition to shop here? The manager, who had tried to remain neutral until now sided with Lucy. Excuse me, sir, but perhaps Madam is right about one thing. This is an elite center, and we have certain standards that we try to maintain. The man raised his eyebrows. Standards? Are you talking about service or people? The manager hesitated, but Lucy immediately interrupted. About people, of course. Such places have their own face, their own audience. And you, excuse my bluntness, don't fit in. His eyes flashed, but he still kept his composure. If I paid for my purchases, if I didn't break any rules, then perhaps it is you, Madam, who don't fit the definition of elite. The crowd began to applaud, but Lucy didn't hear it. Her face twisted in anger as she took one last step forward. You think your money gives you the right to be here. Money isn't everything. It's status. And your status is worthless. The man smiled, but there was no warmth in his smile. You know, Madam, your status is not determined by how much money you have, but by how you treat other people. And by that criterion, your status is below zero. The words fell like thunder. Lucy opened her mouth to respond, but at that moment, 2 police officers, attracted by her call, entered the mall. Their appearance attracted even more attention from the crowd, and their eyes turned to Lucy, who frowned. Her confidence began to evaporate. The man in the wheelchair simply looked at the police officers with a slight grin, as if he already knew how this would all end. The police's appearance seemed to inspire new confidence in Lucy. Her face regained its smug expression, and her voice became louder than before. She walked up to the police officers, head out high, as if she were a heroine who had saved the shopping mall from an imaginary threat. You're finally here, she said, her tone cold and sharp. This man is highly suspicious. I'm sure he has no legitimate reason to make such purchases. You should check him out immediately. The policemen glanced at each other, hesitantly approaching the man, who was still sitting in his wheelchair. His face was calm, but his eyes were tired. This wasn't the first time he'd seen this. It wasn't the first day that someone had judged him not by his actions, but by the color of his skin and his disability. Excuse me, sir, one of the policemen said, trying to sound professional. We've received a call and would like to ask you a few questions. The man looked at them calmly. Of course, ask. I'm ready to answer everything you're interested in. Lucy intervened before they could continue. You don't have to be so polite to him. Do you see what he's done? He's bought up half the boutiques in this mall. People like him never spend that kind of money honestly. Like me, the man repeated, his voice even but tense. Excuse me, but you keep saying you know me. What makes you think you have a right to do that? Because I see who you are, Lucy snapped, her voice rising. You're a nobody. You think you can come here, to a place where people like me feel comfortable, and act like you belong here. The crowd gathered around Frowncy. People did not dare to interface. Some turned away. Others watched as if they were behind a theater stage. The man, without taking his eyes off Lucy, sighed. Your world, he said. You think this mall is your personal domain. Lucy leaned toward him, her voice quieter but even more venomous. Yes, because I am the standard, and you are just an anomaly that needs to be eliminated. The police tried to intervene again. Madam, let us handle the situation. We need to check the documents and make sure everything is in order. The man nodded and pulled out documents from his bag, including receipts for all his purchases. He handed them to the police with a slight smile. Here you go. Everything is paid for, legally and transparently. The officers began to examine the papers, their faces showing a growing understanding that Lucy was wrong, but she was not about to give up her position. Are you blind? She snapped. This is fake. He's just using his disability to make you feel sorry for him. Can you see how he's manipulating you? Manipulate? The man asked quietly. His hands tightened on the armrest of the wheelchair. All I did was come here and buy what I wanted. You do in and see me as a person. You see me as a threat. And that doesn't say anything about me. It says something about you. His words caused a murmur in the crowd. Some began to talk. Others remained silent. The policeman, having checked the documents, nodded. Sir, everything is in order. Your documents are in order, and we see no reason for further questions. But Lucy was relentless. You don't understand. It's not just about the paperwork. It's about what he's doing here. People like him are destroying everything we've achieved. The man looked at her, his voice hardening. You keep saying Lee cut him, but I'm not going to be the shadow you want me to be. I'm a human being, and I have a right to be here, just like you do. The crowd began to applaud. People who had previously stood aside began to stand by his side. Enough, someone said. This is beyond the pale. He didn't do anything, and you're just trying to humiliate him. Lucy looked around at the crowd, her confidence beginning to crumble. She saw that even those who had been silent before were now whispering about her behavior. She tried to speak up, but her words were drowned out by the noise of voices. This is not over, she hissed at the man before walking away. You will pay for daring to challenge the likes of me. The man watched her go, his expression not angry but tired. He knew that this day was just one of many in his struggle, but he also knew that truth was always stronger than hate. Lucy walked down the white hallway of the mall, her steps sharp, her heels clicking loudly on the marble floors. Whispers and looks echoed around. Her judgment, surprise, disdain. She was used to being the center of attention, but now these looks did not bring her the usual sense of superiority. Her world was beginning to crack, but she still did not understand how deep they would become. You will understand everything soon, she said out loud, not even addressing anyone in particular. Her voice sounded like she was trying to convince herself. This man is destroying our order. But no one answered. People turned away to avoid her gaze, or pretended not to hear. Meanwhile, the man in the wheelchair remained in his seat, surrounded by the attention of the crowd. His documents, which he had shown to the police, were returned, and the officers officially confirmed that no violations had occurred. But despite this, his face did not express joy. His gaze was focused, like that of a man who knew that this was just one of many such situations. She won't stop, he said to the police. Her kind always come back. The police looked at each other, unsure how to respond. One of them, clearly embarrassed, nevertheless answered, We are here to maintain order. Sir, if there are any further problems, please call us. Thank you, the man replied calmly, his voice sounding as if he knew the help could only be temporary. Lucy decided to go back to her favorite boutique, where she always felt in control. She thought she would be met with understanding and support. The boutique manager, a young man with a tired look, was still standing at the counter, trying to look busy. You have to do something, Lucy began, her voice sharp again. This man just dared to humiliate me. He's ruining the whole atmosphere of this center. The manager looked up at her, his face neutral. Excuse me, madam, but it seems the police have sorted things out. Figured it out. Her voice rose. You call this figured it out? They didn't do anything. She didn't notice how several customers in the boutique began to listen to her, their looks becoming increasingly judgmental. One woman standing by the window turned to Lucy. Maybe you should calm down, she said. This man did nothing wrong. Calm down, Lucy snapped. You have no idea what you're talking about. People like him shouldn't be in places like this. Like him? The woman asked. Do you hear yourself? It's terrible. Lucy felt her confidence begin to crumble again. She looked around, but instead of support, she saw only empty faces. Even the boutique manager now tried to avoid her gaze. You're all wrong, she said, but her voice was no longer as loud. He's manipulating you. He's using his disability to elicit pity, and you use your status to incite hatred. A voice from the crowd replied. The words sounded like thunder. Lucy frowned. She couldn't believe that someone dared to say it out loud. Her gaze darted from one face to another, but no one supported her anymore. At the other end of them all, a man in a wheelchair was preparing to leave. His assistants were packing up his groceries. As he sat there looking out at the growing crowd, people were coming up to him, offering words of encouragement. Thank you for standing up, the young woman said. What you did was important. I just wanted to buy things, he replied, but sometimes you need more than just protection. The crowd continued to grow. People began asking questions, expressing outrage at Lucy's behavior. Her face and actions became a topic for discussion. A video of her screams had already appeared on the internet and was gaining popularity. Lucy, meanwhile, left the boutique. Her face expressed a mixture of anger and fear. She no longer felt like the owner of this place. Her steps were quick, almost hurried, but wherever she went, it seemed to her that everyone around her was looking at her. "This is not the end," she whispered under her breath. But fear had already settled in her heart. She began to understand that her world, based on prejudice and self-confidence, was beginning to crumble, and this time, no one was going to come to her aid. Lucy Randolph walked out of the boutique, her footsteps ringing like gunshots off the marble walls of the mall. She was beside herself. The crowd gathered around the black man in the wheelchair was beginning to fill her with more than just irritation. She felt her power, her confidence, her stature slipping from her grasp. But that didn't stop her. Instead, it only fueled her hatred. She approached the man again, who Saturday surrounded by his aides and supporters. The crowd grew denser, their gazes growing more hostile toward Lucy. But she didn't notice. All that mattered to her was him, the one she believed threatened her peace. "You think you've won?" She blurted out, stopping right in front of him. Her voice was taut, like a string about to snap. "You think you can come here and play the victim and make us all feel guilty?" A man looked up at her. His face was calm, but there was weariness in his eyes. "I'm not making myself out to be a victim," he said quietly. "You're doing it for me." The words hit her like a blow. Lucy narrowed her eyes, her lips trembling with anger. "You don't understand anything. You're just a problem for all of us. You and people like you are destroying everything we've built." "Like me," he repeated. "You seem to say that often." "Who are us, madam?" The crowd began to whisper. People looked at each other, their faces expressing a mixture of bewilderment and indignation. Lucy, however, was too absorbed in her anger to notice. "We are the ones who work to be here, to earn the right to be in places like this," she said, not taking her eyes off him. "And you just use your condition to make everyone feel sorry for you. It's disgusting." The man sighed. His hands, resting on the armrests of the wheelchair, shook slightly, but he remained composed. "You are so afraid of losing what you have that you are willing to destroy anyone who is not like you." "Afraid?" Lucy snorted. "I have nothing to be afraid of." "You should be afraid. When people realize you're just a fraud, it'll all be over." "A command." The man's voice grew a little louder, but was still calm. "Are you accusing me of doing what you do? Using power and privilege to oppress others?" These words caused a stir in the crowd. People began to openly take his side. "Enough," someone from the onlooker shouted. "He didn't do anything. She just hates him because he's not like her." Another voice added. Lucy looked back, her face twisted in anger. "You all just don't understand. He doesn't belong here. He was never part of our society." The man looked at her again. "If your society is built on hatred, then I am proud not to belong to it." The crowd burst into applause. Lucy felt her face heat up. Her heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed like everyone around her could hear it. She took a step back, but then turned to the police officers who were still nearby. "Why aren't you doing anything?" she cried, her voice shaking. "He's provoking us all. It's dangerous." The policemen looked at each other. One of them stepped forward. "Madam, we have no grounds for intervention. This man has not broken any rules. We advise you to calm down." "Calm down." Her voice grew louder. "Are you on his side? Are you letting him continue?" The policeman shook his head. "We're just following the law." "Madam." These words finally broke her confidence. Lucy looked around. The crowd looked at her with disdain. Even those who had been silent before were now openly expressing their condemnation. She felt the ground slipping from under her feet. The man took advantage of the pause to address the crowd. "Hate is a choice," he said, "but goodness and justice will always be stronger. Today, you have shown that you are willing to defend what is important, and for that, I am grateful." His words were met with loud applause. Lucy couldn't stay here any longer. Her world was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She turned around and hurried toward the exit without looking back. But even as she walked away, her footsteps sounded like a hammer, shattering what she thought was her world. Her hatred had turned against her, and now she was alone, surrounded only by her fears and the knowledge of her vulnerability. Lucy Randolph hurried to her car. which was parked in a shopping mall. The crowd, which had been silent a moment ago, was now actively discussing her behavior. There was no longer a single ally, no understanding look around her. She felt it with her whole being. Every step she took, every click of her heels on the tiles, was vaguely reminiscent of hammer blows on shattered pride. Getting into the car, Lucy slammed the door and frowned for a moment. Her hands were shaking, her face was flushed with humiliation, and her eyes were shining with unbidden tears. She quickly wiped them away, angry at herself for this weakness. "This is not the end," she whispered, turning on the ignition. She drove home, leaving them all behind, but she couldn't leave what had happened behind. Her phone was blowing up with notifications. Videos of her abuse were filling news sites and social media. Comments called her racist, tyrannical, and unfair. People called for a boycott of her business, demanded an apology. Lucy tried to ignore it, but the more she pushed away the reality, the more afraid she became. At home, behind the thick walls of her mansion, she tried to find solace in the silence, but the silence only increased her anxiety. Her mind painted the most terrible scenarios: her husband being fired, her privileges being lost, society rejecting her. "It's all his fault," she whispered to herself, sitting in the dark living room. The man in the wheelchair, his calm, his confidence, all of it made her furious. She considered him an outsider who had disturbed her world, and now this outsider was the cause of her destruction. The next day, she decided to take action. Lucy contacted a group of people she knew, people who shared her views, people who were as blind to change as she was. They met in her home, surrounded by expensive furniture and art. "It was a farce," Lucy began, her voice shaking but trying to sound confident. "This man, his followers, they're trying to destroy everything we've built. We have to do something." "But what exactly?" asked one of the women. "People are already against us. We must show the truth," Lucy replied sharply. "We must prove that he is a fraud, that his actions are merely a way to elicit pity and destroy our status." The assembled people looked at each other. Some were clearly doubtful, but Lucy continued, "If we do nothing, tomorrow they will dictate to us how to live. We cannot allow that to happen." Meanwhile, the man at the center of the scandal stayed home, but events around him continued to unfold. Reporters, community leaders, and activists called him. Some expressed support, others asked questions, trying to understand how he felt about what was happening. "I didn't strive for that," he said in an interview. "I just wanted to live my life like any other person. But it seems that for some people that's unacceptable." His words spread across the internet, sparking a new wave of discussion. People shared their stories of discrimination, the difficulties they faced because of their skin color, their disability, or other factors. The man's story became a symbol of something bigger. Lucy couldn't take it anymore. She felt like she was losing control, like her life was slipping out of her control. She decided to hold a meeting at the mall to restore justice. Her goal was simple: proof that the man was a threat and reclaim her rightful place. But her plan began to crumble from the very beginning. People who did not support her, but were against her ideas, came to the meeting. They began to ask questions, demanding proof of her words. "Why do you think this man has no right to be here?" asked a young woman from the crowd. "Because he uses his position to manipulate people," Lucy replied. "Don't you do the same thing?" A man's voice came from the back row. The crowd began to roar. Lucy tried to shout over them, but her voice was drowned out by the noise. People were no longer listening to her. They saw in her what she hid behind her confident masked: fear, uncertainty, and hatred. The climax was the unexpected appearance of the man himself. He had come to the mall despite the threats, despite everything that had happened. His appearance caused silence, but it was not a silence of respect. It was a silence of tension. "Why are you here?" Lucy asked sharply, her voice shaking. "I have come to show you that fear will not win," he replied. "Your fear of me, of who I am, will not change reality. The reality is that people like you can no longer rule a world based on hate." His words caused a storm of applause. Lucy felt her world finally crumble. Her hatred left her alone, and fear became her only companion. She could no longer deny the obvious. She had lost. The meeting that Lucy had so confidently organized turned into a scene where her hatred was turned against her. People were no longer supporting her. They weren't standing by her side, nodding in agreement with her venomous comments. Now her every move, every word was being judged. Lucy felt it, but she couldn't stop. Her rage and desire to restore her position pushed her further down the path of destruction. The man who had caused her hatred was calm. His carriage slowly approached the crowd, which respectfully parted to let him pass. Lucy frowned, her hands clenched into fists, her eyes blazing with contempt. "You're here again," she said, her voice shaking but trying to sound confident. "Have you come to play the victim again?" The man paused, his gaze focused, almost cold. "I didn't come for you. I'm here to remind people that hate is a choice, and you made your choice." The crowd began to roar. Some were applauding, others were talking among themselves. Lucy felt her heart sink. She was no longer in control of the situation, and it was driving her crazy. "Hate?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You dare talk to me about hate? You invaded our world, our space, destroyed our comfort, and now you blame us." The man answered calmly, "Your comfort is built on excluding people like me. You call it order, but it's just fear." "Fear?" Lucy cried, her face turning red. "You're the one who's afraid. You're afraid that people will see you for what you really are, a con man, using his position to manipulate society." He leaned forward, his voice firmer. "You believe in your own superiority so blindly that you don't even notice how your own behavior is destroying you." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. The crowd frowned. People looked at Lucy, seeing in her not the confident woman they knew, but a person consumed by her fears and hatred. She didn't give up. "Oh," her voice came back, but now it was shrill, almost hysterical. "Are you all on his side?" she shouted, looking around the crowd. "Do you really think he has the right to be here, in this place we built for ourselves?" The crowd began to whisper. Someone shouted, "This place is for everyone, not just you." "Yeah, that's enough. He didn't do anything except just come here, just like us." Lucy took a step back. Her legs were shaking. She could no longer see her allies. Even those who had been silent before were now looking at her with disdain. But the hardest blow was yet to come. Suddenly, a young woman emerged from the crowd. Her face was calm, but there was a fire in her eyes. "You know, madam," she began, "I kept silent for a long time, because I thought it was none of my business. But you made me speak. Your words are poison. You talk about order, but in reality, you are simply afraid that your world is changing." Lucy tried to answer, but was interrupted. "You blame him for being different, but it is not he who is destroying your world. It is you who are destroying yourself with your hatred." The crowd began to applaud. Lucy felt her face heat up. She couldn't take it anymore. She turned and hurried away. But even as she walked away, she could hear the shouts and applause. The sounds haunted her, like an echo of her own collapse. At home, another blow awaited her. Her phone was blowing up with notifications. News of her behavior was spreading across platforms. Videos of her screaming and insulting her were viewed millions of times. Comments called her a symbol of hate. Her name became a meme, her face a reminder that hate would no longer be tolerated. Lucy sat her down on the sofa, her head in her hands. Her world was crumbling. Her order, her comfort were destroyed. She was left alone, surrounded by silence, which became her only companion. But this silence was not salvation, but punishment. She could no longer ignore the reality. Her hatred had destroyed everything she considered important. Now she could only realize her vulnerability and the fear that her world would never return to the way it was. Lucy Randolph woke to the sound of notifications on her phone. Her first thought was that this was all just a nightmare, but when she picked up her phone, she immediately realized that the reality was far worse. Her face and name were everywhere. Social media notifications, news headlines, comments, they were all aimed at her. Lucy Randolph, symbol of hate in modern society. Read one headline, "She wants to return the world to the old order of discrimination," wrote the popular journalist on his blog. Lucy felt cold sweat running down her back. She clutched the phone so tightly that her fingers turned white. Her hands were shaking. "It was them," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It was them who did all this." She was sure that it was not her words or her actions that were to blame, but him, that black man in the wheelchair. For her, he was the embodiment of all her fears. Her anger began to flare up again. At the same time, on the other side of the city, the man who had become the object of her hatred was watching the news. Activists, reporters, even politicians were calling him. His story became a symbol of the fight against hatred and discrimination. But instead of joy, he felt tired. "That's not what I wanted," he said, hanging up after another call. I just wanted to live my life." His assistant, a young man who was always there, nodded. "But now you have become the voice of those who cannot speak." He said, "It is more than you." The man nodded, but there was sadness in his eyes. "I know, but the hatred I faced won't just go away. People like her don't change." Meanwhile, Lucy took her last desperate step. She contacted several of her acquaintances, those who shared her views, those who also believed that the world was moving in the wrong direction. "We can't let this go on," she said at a meeting in her home. Her voice was sharp but trembling. "They want to destroy us. They want to take away everything we've built." "What do you suggest?" asked one of the men sitting opposite her. "We have to show them that we won't give up," she said. "We'll organize our own meeting. We'll prove that people support us." Her words caused mixed reactions. Some nodded, but their eyes showed uncertainty. Others remained silent, looking away. Even among her own, Lucy was no longer completely confident of support. The day of her meeting arrived. She found herself back in the mall, in the very place where her scandal had occurred. But instead of confidence, she was overcome with fear. People were coming, but they were not the ones she had expected. Instead of a crowd of her supporters, those who were against her had gathered. They stood with signs that read, "No hate, a shopping mall for everyone, justice for all." Lucy felt her legs shaking. She took a step back, but then she noticed that the man she hated was there too. He was sitting in his wheelchair, surrounded by people who were supporting him. "Why are you here?" she cried out, unable to contain herself. Her voice was hysterical, but trembling with fear. He looked at her calmly, his gaze firm. "I'm here to show that hate will not win." The crowd began to applaud. Lucy looked around. Her eyes met down scenes. Hundreds of disapproving stares. She felt the world crumbling around her. "You don't understand," she cried. "This man is a threat to our order." "Your order?" A voice came from the crowd. It was a young woman. "You call hatred order?" The crowd cheered and applauded. Lucy tried to say something, but her voice was drowned out by the noise. She could no longer control anything. When the meeting ended, Lucy returned home, broken and shattered. Her name meant nothing anymore. She was rejected by society, by her friends, even by her own family. Her world had finally collapsed. She sat her day in silence, surrounded by luxury that no longer brought her comfort. Her hatred had left her alone, and in that moment she realized that hatred is the hardest isolation. The crowd outside the mall grew by the minute. People came not only from the surrounding areas, but also from other cities. The news of a black man in a wheelchair who had become a victim of hatred and discrimination spread all over the internet. Videos of the incident, where Lucy Randolph openly insulted him, gained millions of views. Public outrage had reached its peak, and now people came not only to express their support for the man, but also to show that hatred would no longer be tolerated. There was a huge crowd at the entrance to the mall. People held signs that read, "Equality for all. Justice matters. Hate is weakness." Reporters, photographers, and cameramen were broadcasting live. The atmosphere was tense, but filled with the energy of change. Everyone in the crowd knew that this moment could be a turning point not only for the man, but for everyone who faces discrimination. At the center of this storm of change was a man. He is Saturday in his wheelchair, surrounded by a wave of support. People came up to him to shake his hand, to show solidarity, or simply to say they were on his side. His face remained calm, but his eyes were determined. He knew that this day would be the beginning of something bigger. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the crowd, hidden behind the closed curtains of her home, Lucy Randolph watched. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. She saw it all, the crowd, the reporters, the cameras. She saw how her own words, captured on video, were now being used against her. Each time her insults were played on the screen, her heart sank and her hands shook with anger and fear. "It can't be true," she whispered, looking at the screen. "They just don't understand that I wanted to keep order. It's all their fault, his fault." But even her own excuses were unconvincing. She no longer felt the comfort that had always accompanied her. Her name had become a symbol of hatred, her face a meme. The calls from friends who could have supported her had stopped. The people who had once supported her views were now silent. Even they understood that times had changed, and Lucy was alone. Across town, in a shopping mall, a man finally raised his hand to ask for silence. The crowd frowned, tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. His voice was firm but calm. I am grateful to each and every one of you for being here. Today, I am not fighting just for myself. I am fighting for everyone who has ever felt isolated, rejected, humiliated. This is not about hate. This is about love, about justice, about equality. We all deserve to live in a world where our differences are respected, not judged. These words caused a storm of applause. People shouted his name, raised placards, and reporters rushed to record every phrase. But the man continued, I want this to not just be my moment. This is our moment. The moment when we say no to hatred and discrimination. The moment when we choose justice. Lucy watched with the terrifying realization that the world no longer supported her. She felt her walls crumbling. Her truth, her order, none of it mattered anymore. She was no longer someone who was listened to. Her voice was drowned in a sea of justice. The crowd dispersed late that night, but they left behind more than just memories. They left behind a symbol of hope. The man went home, knowing that this day had changed not only his life, but the lives of many others. And Lucy remained in the darkness of her home, surrounded by the silence that became her only companion. Lucy Saturday in the darkness of her living room, surrounded by a cold silence. The whole house seemed empty and oppressive, although it had once been her fortress. The large windows that had let in light were now tightly curtained, as if even daylight had become a threat. She was afraid that someone might be standing outside, watching her, laughing at her fall. Her phone was lying on the table, the screen flickering with another notification. But Lucy couldn't bear to watch anymore. She knew what was there. New comments condemning her, new articles with her name in the headlines, new videos where her face became a symbol of hate. Her gaze was fixed on the small crack in the wall opposite, but her mind was filled with the memories of the past few days. Every cry from the crowd, every condemnation, every word spoken to her or against her echoed in her head. She could no longer separate reality from her fear. They hate me, she whispered, her voice weak and trembling. She looked at the phone again, but instead of picking it up, she stood up abruptly. Her movements were chaotic, almost hysterical. She began to pace the room, clasping her hands. Her thoughts were confused, but one thing was clear, she no longer felt safe. They want to destroy me, she said, looking into the mirror. Her reflection seemed alien to her. The face she saw no longer expressed confidence and power. It was exhausted, full of fear and vulnerability. She tried to calm herself. It's temporary. It's just temporary, she repeated, but the words brought no comfort. She walked to the window, carefully pulling the curtains aside. The street was quiet, but the silence was not comforting. She saw a lone figure on the sidewalk. It could have been just a passerby, but Lucy felt like it was someone watching her. Her heart began to pound, and she quickly closed the curtains back. The voice of the man she had insulted sounded in her head. Your fear is destroying you. Those words, spoken with absolute calm, now sounded like a prophecy. She heard the crowd applauding again, the shouts of people expressing their support for him. She remembered their faces, all those who no longer saw her as a leader, but only as a person filled with hatred. Her world collapsed. She could no longer convince herself that she was right, but instead of realizing her mistake, she was overcome by a new fear of what would happen next. She began to think that this was not the end. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. It was a quiet but insistent knock. Lucy frowned. She went to the door, but did not dare open it. Her heart was beating wildly. Her hands were shaking. Who's there? She shouted, but there was no answer. She looked through the people but saw no one. Her fear grew. She felt cornered, and her fear was turning into paranoia. Finally, she decided to call her friend, the only one who could support her, but her call remained unanswered. She tried again, then another number, but all her attempts met with silence. Lucy began to realize that she was alone. No one was ready to stand by her side anymore. In desperation, she picked up her phone and opened social media. Her name was everywhere, but not a single post was in her defense. Even her old friends, who had previously supported her views, were now silent or, worse, openly condemning her. This is the end, she whispered, lowering her head. But that wasn't the worst part. She wasn't afraid of being judged anymore. She realized that the hatred she lived with wasn't giving her strength. It was destroying her from the inside. And now that hatred was turning against her, Lucy felt like she was losing herself. In the mirror, she saw her reflection again. This time, she felt like her eyes were looking at her with condemnation. She looked away, but the feeling remained. Her confidence was gone, replaced by fear. She no longer knew who she was. And when night fell on her house, Lucy was left alone in the darkness, surrounded by her own fear, which seemed to be her only companion. Her world was destroyed, and no one came to her aid anymore. Lucy Randolph Saturday at her living room window, looking out at the empty street. Once, the view had brought her peace, the assurance that the world beyond was hers. But now her windows felt more like a boundary between her own personal hell and the outside world that had turned its back on her. The voices of the crowd still echoed in her head. Justice for all. No more hate. The cry seemed to eat away at her from the inside. She tried to justify her actions to herself over and over again, but her words lost their meaning. At some point, she realized that her entire world was built on false notions of superiority and status. This thought struck her like a bolt of thunder. She turned away from the window and closed her eyes, but instead of peace, she felt only growing fear. Meanwhile, events were unfolding around her. The man she had tried so hard to humiliate had become a symbol of change. His face appeared on magazine covers. His voice was heard in interviews and at rallies. But he did not speak of revenge or retribution. He spoke of forgiveness, of the importance of overcoming hatred and learning to live in peace. "I don't want her to suffer," he said in an interview, "but I want her to understand that hatred is destruction, and it always starts with the one who wears it." The words reached Lucy when she finally dared to turn on the television. She heard his voice, confident and gentle, speaking not of her punishment, but of how the world could be a better place. Her eyes filled with tears. They were not tears of self-pity, but tears of realization of how far she had gone in her hatred. The next day, she tried to leave the house. It was her first step outside in several days. But as soon as she approached the store, the looks of those around her pierced her like needles. People turned away, some whispered behind her back, and some openly looked at her with disdain. She felt her legs give way, and quickly returned home, slamming the door behind her. Her isolation became total. No one called, no one came. She realized that she was alone now. Her voice meant nothing anymore. Even her family was becoming distant. Her children avoided talking to her. Her husband spent more time away from home. She found herself face to face with her fear, the fear of oblivion. But at that moment, when her world seemed to be completely destroyed, she heard a knock on the door. It was a man in a wheelchair. She didn't immediately understand who he was, but as soon as she saw his face, her breath caught. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice weak, almost a whisper. "I didn't come to blame you," he said calmly. "I came to give you a chance." Lucy didn't know what to say. She stood in the doorway, feeling her fear turn to shame. "A chance?" she asked again. "A chance for what?" "To change yourself," he said. "Your actions have caused pain, but hatred should not be your end." These words were a blow to her. She felt her pride crumble completely. She tried to find words to justify herself, but instead she said, "I'm sorry." Her voice shook, but there was truth in it. The man nodded. "It's a start," he said, "but an apology isn't enough. It's important to take action." His words ignited something new in her, a tiny spark of hope. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could find a path to redemption. In the following weeks, Lucy began to change. She contacted organizations that supported equality, began to participate in their projects. She publicly apologized for her words and actions. The world did not forgive her immediately, but her sincere efforts began to change people's attitudes. The man who caused her downfall was also the reason for her rebirth. He demanded nothing from her except honesty with himself, and that was her greatest lesson. Now Lucy knew that hatred destroys, and forgiveness and kindness create. Her fears were a thing of the past, and she began to build a new life where there was no more room for hatred. Friends, thank you for reading this story to the end. It raises important and difficult questions about justice, equality, and the ability to change. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you or your loved ones experienced racism or injustice? How did you cope with it? Your thoughts and stories are incredibly important to us, and we would love to read them. We appreciate each and every one of you. Your support inspires us to create stories that make us think and change the world for the better. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. This will help us grow and make even more useful content. Have a wonderful and kind day. Remember, every action you take can make this world a little better.